And now, please remain seated as we sing our in-gathering hymn, number 381, and the words appear in your order of service. Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Madison. This is a community where curious seekers gather to explore spiritual, ethical, and social issues in an accepting and nurturing environment. Unitarian Universalism supports the freedom of conscience of each individual, as together we seek to be a force for good in the world. My name is Karen Rose Gredler, and on behalf of the congregation, I would like to extend a special welcome to visitors, and I know we have several with us. We are a welcoming congregation, so whomever you are and wherever you happen to be in your life's journey, we celebrate your presence among us. Newcomers are encouraged to stay for our fellowship hour after the service and to visit the library, which is directly across from the center doors of this auditorium. Bring your drinks and your questions. Members of our staff and lay ministry will be on hand to welcome you. You may also look for persons holding teal-colored stoneware coffee mugs. These are FUS members knowledgeable about our faith community who would welcome visiting with you. Experienced guides are generally available to give a building tour after our services, so if you would like to learn more about this sustainably designed addition or our national landmark meeting house across the parking lot, please meet near the large glass window on what is your left side of the auditorium after the service. We welcome children to stay for the duration of the service. However, because it is difficult for some in attendance to hear in this lively acoustical environment, our child haven back in that corner and the commons area behind the auditorium are excellent places to retire if a child becomes agitated or would like to talk, move around. The service can still be seen and heard from those areas. This would also be a great time to turn off all devices that might cause a disturbance during this hour, especially cell phone ringers, if you please. I'd now like to acknowledge those individuals who help our services run smoothly. On sound, I'm not 100% sure who we have back there. Dan and Dan, maybe? We have fewer volunteers in the summer, so there wasn't anybody signed up. If anyone wants to learn to do the sound work, please see one of us. And Smiley is our lay minister, and she was also doubling as a greeter upstairs when you came in. As ushers, we have Sam Bates, Ron Cook, and Elizabeth Barrett. And back in the kitchen, we have Jeannie Hills making coffee and lemonade, I believe, and Rick DeVita is helping her. Please note the announcements in your red floors insert in your order of service, which describe upcoming events at the Society and provide more information about today and the near future. we would call your attention to the inside of the first sheet titled Shawl Ministry. The FUS Shawl Ministry creates shawls and laptop robes for the congregation who are ill, grieving, or experiencing other life challenges. Also, each child who is dedicated at FUS receives a handmade blanket created by the Shawl Ministry. If you're interested in becoming involved with that service activity, please stop by the table in the Commons right after the service and you can learn more about it. Lorna Aronson will be available to answer some questions, or you may contact the email listed there on that announcement. So that's especially important. We need shawl makers, and it's nice for everybody to know where the nice blankets that we give out come from. Again, welcome. We hope today's service will stimulate your mind, touch your heart, and stir your spirit.
These opening words were composed by my colleague Gary Kowalski. To the God above the God of any single nation, the God who unites the people of the world in the bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood and peace. To the God above the God of any single ideology, the God who knows that one human life is more valuable than all the systems of the world. To the God above the God of any single religion, whose goodness and inspiration are the possession of all people of faith. And to the God above God, who brings humility to our minds, reverence to our hearts, to this God we dedicate ourselves in work, and in wonder. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit for the lighting of our chalice. And if you will join with me in reading the words of affirmation printed in the program. This religious society is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences, beneath all our diversity, there is a unity which makes us one and binds us together in spite of time and death and the distance between the stars. And now I would invite you on this fine July morning to turn to your neighbor and exchange with them a warm greeting. And so on this beautiful July morning, on a weekend when we celebrate the birth of our nation, we pause to acknowledge the presence among us of two children who are just beginning their life's journey. In this season of sunny days and fragrant nights, we join Charles and Artemis's parents in welcoming them into our homes and into this, our spiritual community. Today, we offer these families our friendship and our support in the opportunities and the challenges that lie before them. We trust that the commitment to and love for each other is strong in the Bermont and Lanao families. May these youngsters, therefore, be blessed with secure homes, dependable caregivers, that they may enjoy the freedom to develop their own personalities and to shape their own unique destinies. Our tradition, Unitarian Universalism, holds that every person comes into this world fresh, unsullied, possessing inherent worth and dignity. And this morning we would acknowledge that these two children, Artemis and Charles, are bona fide human beings with their own special gifts, with needs and with feelings that matter just as much as any of ours. Although they have yet to fully unfold, Charles and Artemis are already vital, active participants in their family's whole life. They are full partners in the work and play of living, and they are true heirs to all of our dreams and our values. Now, dedication does not make these children full-fledged members of First Unitarian Society, for that is a choice that eventually they must make for themselves when they attain the age of reason. But this ritual today does affirm Artemis and Charles's place in our hearts and affords them the opportunity to gain the emotional security and spiritual opportunity that a Unitarian Universalist faith community such as this one can provide. And so we are glad that, moved by a sense of the blessings of parenthood and trust in this spiritual community, that Mike and Anya, Chris and Betsy have chosen to express their own values and their own progressive religious faith through this celebration. And yet ultimately, it is not just them, it's all of us as parishioners, friends, relatives, who will be responsible for the teaching and the nurture of these children. And so by presenting them to you, their parents acknowledge that Artemis and Charles are more than just private possessions. They are young souls in whom we all have a stake, and for which we all wish the best. On this day of great promise, then, we not only dedicate these lovely and gifted youngsters, we dedicate ourselves to them, to their interests, their future, and their welfare. And now I would invite our two families to come forward and join me on the stage area. Crowded up here.
And now, if those in our congregation will please look at your insert called Congregational Pledge and recite it with me, please. For the gift of childhood, whose innocence, laughter, and curiosity bring hope, joy, and new understanding into our lives, we lift thankful hearts. We welcome Charles and Artemis into this spiritual community and extend to their parents our love and support in the joys and challenges of caregiving. As these children grow, we will share with them our insights, our values, and our dreams, that they may enjoy the rich benefits of our religious heritage. Also among us today are several people who bear a special and close relationship to Charles. Please stand as I call your name. Grandparents Bob and Nancy Wearmouth, Bob and Joko Burmant, great-grandparents John and Marilyn Wearmouth, Doug and Lisa Wearmouth, Marty and Ann Robinson, Charles' great-uncles and aunts, Uncle Eric Wearmouth, and cousin Kelly Robinson. Thank you all for being here. Accompanying Artemis, we welcome sponsors Karen Linnell Peterson. Oh yeah, stay up, I'm gonna make you say something. Dan and Sue Linnell, Judy Peterson, Uncle Kurt Peterson, and grandparents Beth and Dale Milhans. What? And Stefan Peterson. Oh, I missed him, he's on the list, sorry. Anybody else for any of these folks? This is a great turnout, thank you. And cousins, okay, cousins stand up too, please. My friends, do you take upon yourselves the privilege and responsibility to nurture, defend, and support the freedom and growing spirit of the child to whom you are related? Will you recognize his or her worth as a person and encourage that child to speak truthfully and from the heart? Will you share with him or her the best that is in you, the insights, the values, the dreams that give your life meaning? Finally, will you help this youngster to understand not only his or her own rights, but also the rights of others? If so, please say, "We will."
Please be seated. And so now to our parents who have brought their children before us, Betsy and Chris, Anya and Mike. It is your privilege and obligation to provide an environment both of security and of challenge. There have been times when we've lost those. It is your responsibility to provide an environment of both security and challenge for your child to grow up in. Do you commit yourselves to promote your youngster's physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being? Will you respect as well as protect your son or daughter and bestow your love as a free and unmerited gift? And do you also reaffirm your commitment to care for and to support each other as partners in life and in parenting? And if so, please say "We will." And now in the act of dedication, we use the symbolism of water as a sign of our common heritage. In our tradition, there is no suggestion of the washing away of inherited sin. We believe these children came into the world with the limitations that are natural to human beings, but we believe that they arrived here innocent. So water in this context stands for vitality. It is the elixir of life, the foundation of all living being. For purposes of today's ceremony, a portion of this water has been saved from our annual water communion service, which takes place in August, to which members bring water from their travels across the continent and throughout the world. And so its use here reminds us of our universal, our common bond with all-embracing and ever-sustaining nature. And name this child. Charles Robert Berman. We dedicate you in the name of truth, the promise of love, and in the fellowship of this society. It is water. And name this child. Artemis May Lenow. We dedicate you in the name of truth, promise of love, and the fellowship of this society. May each of you be granted clarity of thought, integrity of speech, and above all, compassionate hearts.
As a token of dedication, we give to each child a rosebud, fragrant reminders and symbol of beauty, promise, and love.
They're also tasty.
Yeah. This rose has no thorns, symbolizing the better world we would give to our children if it were in our power. While we know that the world is not altogether as lovely as this rosebud, we hope that Charles and Artemis will learn to recognize the beauty and goodness which does exist, and that they will grow in wisdom and compassion, adding their own beauty to the world. As this rose unfolds in natural beauty, so may your lives unfold.
And so we conclude our celebration with words from Kenneth Patton, former minister of this congregation. The child has come forth from the great womb of the earth. The child has come forth to stand with stardust in his hair, the rush of planets in his blood, the shining in his eyes like sunlight, with hands to shape with the same force that shaped him out of the raw stuff of the universe. When one baby is born, it's a symbol of all birth and all life, and therefore all must rejoice, all must smile, and lose their hearts to the children. And now we present, as Karen had alluded earlier in her announcements, comfort blankets, which we do give to all of our children when they are dedicated, and as well, also a certificate of dedication. Let's give our two families a hand. And as they were returning to their seats, I invite you now to turn to our next hymn, our hymn of dedication, and we will sing together verses 1, 2, and 5. And at this time, any children that are going to summer fun may depart. So we continue our service now with a selection from Mohandas K. Gandhi's book, Nonviolent Resistance. The question is, shall I bear with those who create difficulties for me, or shall I destroy them? At some time in the past, an ancient seeker after truth realized that he who went on destroying others did not make spiritual headway, but simply stayed right where he was. On the other hand, the man who suffered those who created difficulties, he marched ahead, and at times even succeeded in taking others with him. The first act of destruction taught him that the truth, which was the object of his quest, was not outside himself, but rather within. And hence, the more he took to violence, the more he receded from truth. For in fighting the imagined enemy without, he neglected the enemy within. Now, we punish thieves because we think that they harass us, that they do us wrong. They may leave us alone, but then they will transfer their attentions to another victim. The other victim, however, is also a human being, ourselves in a different form, and so we end up caught in this vicious circle. The trouble from thieves continues to increase because they think it is their business to steal. But in the end, we see it is better to endure the thieves than to punish them. The forbearance may even bring them to their senses. By enduring them, we realize that the thieves too are not different from ourselves. They are our brethren, our friends, and they ought not be punished. But whilst we may bear with the thieves, we must not endure the affliction. That would only induce cowardice. And so we realize that we have a further duty. Since we regard the thieves as our kith and kin, they must be made to realize that kinship. And so we must take pains to devise ways and means of winning them over. And this is the path of nonviolence, of ahimsa. It may entail continuous suffering and the cultivation of endless patience. Given these two conditions, the thief is bound in the end to turn away from his evil ways. And thus, step by step, we learn how to make friends with the world. A tall order. And the second reading is a traditional tale retold by the contemporary writer Anthony Nansen. Once there were two kingdoms that shared a common border. And in one of these kingdoms, the people worshiped the sun, and in the other, they worshiped the moon. And because of their religious differences, the two kingdoms ultimately came to blows. Each gathered an army, and the two armies met at the frontier. Row upon row of warriors, sunlight glinting on their war gear, faced each other across the no man's land. But to avoid great bloodshed, the leaders of these two nations ultimately agreed that each side would send forth a champion to fight in single combat. The strongest, most skillful warrior from each army was selected. The two men advanced toward each other, grim-faced, with a sword in one hand and a shield in the other. On the chest of one was emblazoned the symbol of the sun, and on the other, an image of the moon. And when they met, they fought like demons. Their battle lasted through the morning, and as the sun rose higher, they fought through the midday heat. They fought on and on, neither one of them able to gain an advantage, until the sun at last had set and the sky had turned a dusky orange. By then, they were both utterly exhausted, and they fell to the ground, too feeble even to crawl back to their respective camps. "I hate you," groaned the champion of the sun. "And I hate you," replied the champion of the moon. "I have to kill you," said the champion of the sun. "Back home, I have a wife who loves me, a little boy who wants to become a warrior like me. I have to protect them from the likes of you and your kind." "I had a wife," said the champion of the moon. "Your people killed her in the last war, and that's why I have to kill you." The moon rose, and presently the champion of the sun asked the other man, "What was she like, your wife?" "She was lovely and kind. We had been sweethearts since we were children. I used to play with her in the woods nearby to here." "Sounds like you had a happy childhood," said the champion of the sun. "Not like mine. My father made us work all day in the fields, and if we ever complained, he beat us." "I'm sorry to hear that," said the champion of the moon. And so they continued talking about their respective childhoods and the other things that they had done with their lives. They talked as the moon rose high into the sky, continued talking as it descended into the west. For only an hour or two did these two warriors sleep side by side, their weapons beside them. The sky turned gray and then pink, and the warriors awoke to the sounds and smells of breakfast being prepared in the two camps. Wearied, painfully, they rose to their feet. They looked into each other's eyes and reached out to embrace. And then, leaving their swords and shields behind, they walked slowly back to their respective armies. You see, they could not fight anymore. You cannot fight someone when you know their story. We have been graced with 2 original compositions today, and the poetess is sitting back there who wrote the words for the last song, and Karlos provided the music for both that and the first song that we heard as our prelude, and I was flattered that Karlos dedicated that first piece to me. First time that's ever happened. As of this weekend, 14 individuals have entered the race for the Republican presidential nomination, with 2 others, including our own sitting governor, waiting in the wings. 5 Democrats have signaled their intention to vie for the presidency, not including the current Vice President, Joe Biden. But the individual who presently is getting the most attention is, of course, the flamboyant Donald Trump, whose poll numbers have enjoyed a significant bump since he announced his candidacy. Now, at this point, I suspect that most of us are aware of the now infamous speech that Trump delivered upon entering the race. When Mexico sends its people to the U.S., he warned, they're sending people who have a lot of problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crimes, they're rapists. And in reaction to those inflammatory remarks about undocumented immigrants, several corporations quickly cut their ties with Donald Trump. But among a certain segment of the voting public, his attack seems to have struck a responsive chord, for he was, as he himself put it, telling it like it is. Illegal Mexican immigrants, they're not just competitors for American jobs and for social services. They are bad guys. They are violent. They are larcenous. They are predatory. They are, according to Donald Trump, enemies of all upstanding legal U.S. citizens. Now, immigration is a highly contentious issue right now, and it's likely to be the subject of ongoing debate up to and through the 2016 general elections. But politicians have a choice on this issue and many others. They can present cogent reasons and honest facts to defend their position, or they can appeal to voters' raw fears and prejudices. Too often in recent years, public figures have chosen the latter route. Why are we so quick to make enemies of those who differ from us or who disagree with us? The Supreme Court recognized the rights of gays and lesbians to marry, and opponents were quick to label the ruling a travesty. These have been the darkest 24 hours in our nation's history, Ted Cruz lamented. Really? And in his dissenting opinion, Justice Samuel Alito warned that Americans who are unwilling to assent to this new orthodoxy will risk being labeled as bigots and treated as such by government, employers, and schools. In other words, what Justice Alito was saying is that the formerly persecuted will now become the persecutors, using their newfound right to marry to curtail the right of others to discriminate. Clearly, there are times when it makes sense to regard someone as an enemy. Even if, as Gandhi insisted, we are able to recognize those who harm us as fellow human beings, their behavior still has to be challenged, their power resisted. We will always have to deal with individuals and with institutions that seek to advance their own agenda at your or my expense, using whatever means, coercive or otherwise, that they have available. Call them adversaries, call them enemies. We rightly recognize them as entities wholly unconcerned with our well-being. There are always going to be people and institutions like that, but in our culture, enemies seem to be everywhere. And to hear some discuss the subject, one would think that we were surrounded on all sides by these malign and destructive forces. And you know, this may be a peculiarly American characteristic. Back in 1964, half a century ago, the historian Richard Hofstadter penned an essay entitled "The Paranoid Style in American Politics." The paranoid style in American politics. Although he did not employ the word paranoid in a clinical sense, he did argue that that word came as close as any to capturing a trend that has figured prominently for decades in our national discourse. No other word, Hofstadter said, adequately evokes the sense of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy that I witness, that I have in mind. Now, societies are comprised of various groups that seek to further their own interests. And in a healthy social system, the players exhibit a willingness to negotiate in good faith and to reach solutions that promise at least some mutual benefit and that promote the common good. In such healthy systems, we regard our competitors not as implacable enemies, but as rather the loyal opposition, people who accept the need for some give and take, for some degree, at least, of collaboration. And that's the way things should be. But when the paranoid style asserts itself, people become overeager to draw their lines in the sand. Positions become polarized, and politics is treated as a zero-sum game played out between the good guys and the bad guys. Parker Palmer reminds us that partisanship is not the problem. Demonizing the other side is. So what causes people to act this way? According to Richard Hofstadter, citizens begin to feel paranoid when they perceive that the defining principles and practices of their society are being slowly and insidiously undermined. It may begin with just a grievance or two, but once their fears, their anxieties have been raised, once their suspicions have been kindled, people seek all kinds of extra confirming evidence. And thus they may well develop conspiracy theories, ultimately reaching the conclusion that the country's most powerful institutions are complicit. And thus, for a not insignificant segment of the American public, America's arch enemy is not ISIS, it is not Al-Qaeda, it's the executive branch of our own government. As columnist Matt Barber opined back in January, Barack Hussein Obama is the greatest threat I know of to our national security. He is the enemy within. What's going on in people's heads when they begin to think this way? And the second question, how do we get them to think differently, to be less prone to find a fresh enemy under every overturned rock? Well, two interrelated factors come into play when people begin to characterize the other as an enemy. One is this profound sense of grievance, the conviction that their interests aren't being served, that their values aren't being honored. But then secondly, people come to closely identify with a group that both fosters and supports their sense of grievance. Jonathan Haidt argues that people bind themselves into political teams that share moral narratives, and once they accept a particular narrative, they become blind to alternative moral worlds. Haidt says that social science research has pretty well established that people care about their groups, whether ethnic, racial, religious, regional, political. They care about their groups more than they do their individual self-interest. Our politics, he says, are groupish, not selfish. Now, we can certainly have enemies at the individual level, but when we strongly identify with a particular group, its enemies, for better or for worse, become our enemies. The horrors that unfolded in countries like Rwanda, Bosnia, Sudan, Kenya, and that are tearing Syria and Iraq apart today. These conflicts attest to the powerful hold that a group can have on its members. And when the group becomes the primary locus of one's identity, empathy for anybody in another group goes right out the window. Jeffrey Gettleman remembers being in Kenya in 2008 as national elections were about to be held. Vying for the presidency of Kenya were two men representing different tribes, Kikuyu on the one hand and Kalenjin on the other. And even after decades of independence, many Kenyans retain these strong tribal ties. And as that election campaign grew increasingly contentious, the country was shaken by tribal unrest. Hundreds of people were killed. Gettleman says, I met a farmer whose house had just been torched by his neighbors. He was Kikuyu. The neighbors were Kalenjin. When the mob formed at his door, the farmer assured his wife, things are going to be okay. These aren't outsiders. These are people we know. They're just the boys next door. So he went outside and he asked them, what's the problem? We've been friends for years. But all the farmer got back was the cold glare of strangers. The disputed election had changed everything. Today is today, said the mob. You are no longer our friend. People living in Bosnia and Croatia were similarly affected by the Balkan crisis of the early 1990s. Friends and neighbors for generations were abruptly and fatally divided along religious and ethnic lines. The Croatian writer Slavenka Drakulic describes how, before the breakup of the Yugoslav Republic, she had defined herself in many different ways. She was an educated woman, she was a professional, she was an individual with certain unique characteristics. But, she said, the Serbian-Croatian War stripped me of all those defining marks, except simply that I was Croatian. Everyone in the Balkans, Michael Ignatieff observes, ended up imprisoned in this fiction of pure ethnic identity. Why people in this relatively modern, cosmopolitan part of the world suddenly become invested in a form of identity that had remained largely dormant for decades, if not for centuries? Fear, for one thing. Stoked by the resurrection of long-buried memories of ethnic strife, ultimately people came to believe that those who did not share with them their ethnic heritage could no longer be trusted, that they were not safe to be around, and thus the need for ethnic cleansing. And a second factor, especially in economically stratified countries like Kenya and Sudan, another factor is resentment. Inequality is what gives ethnicity its edge, said a former Kenyan government official, John Githongo. When members of one group perceive that another group is seeking to bend the system to their advantage, they develop this strong sense of collective grievance, which then serves to strengthen their ethnic identification. Now, in our own country, these deep divisions ostensibly play out along party rather than ethnic lines, although one does discern a strong undercurrent of racial and ethnic animosity in so many of our national debates. So for someone like Ted Nugent, the conservative rock musician, Barack Obama isn't just a politician whose policies he abhors. The president, Nugent told an audience recently, is a subhuman mongrel who weaseled his way into the White House. And increasingly, we read comments from aggrieved white Americans that tend to fit very snugly into Hofstadter's description of the paranoid style. Immigrants, they're running the country, receiving the lion's share of government benefits, are accorded all these special privileges. Look around, says C. Fred Alford, political psychologist. Look around, the world is full of hate. There are dozens of groups, he says, now pocked in perpetual hatred. And it's not that they can't get out, it's that no one wants to get out. Because hatred is so seductive, a self-chosen bondage to another that serves to structure the psyche. Now, each year, the 4th of July provides an occasion for citizens of this country to remember and to celebrate the values and traditions that bring us together, that allow us to bridge our differences. This is a valuable holiday, a valuable practice, for if we can look beyond the ubiquitous flags and the firework displays, it may yet be possible for us to put down our swords and shields and begin engaging more constructively with those countrymen that we have come to regard as enemies. The most potent antidote to hate, Lawrence Sternberg suggests, is to find a way that you can identify a good that transcends the groups to which you belong. How do we accomplish that? How do we discover that transcendent good? Jesus suggests that the path is by loving one another, by loving our enemies. And what's that about? Love your enemies? Pretty tall order. But if we object to the politics of polarization, if we are disturbed by the tone and the tenor of our current public discourse, if we do not want our children to be burdened with this crippling legacy, we need to find a way to love. Now, when Jesus invoked love, he probably had two things in mind. First, empathy. And curiously enough, the second, self-interest. One of Jesus' great talents was his ability to relate to just about anybody. Jesus was Jewish, but in the broadest sense of that word. He didn't identify with any particular sect of Judaism, Sadducee, Essene, Pharisee, and he did not restrict his dealings to persons who were deemed acceptable by those various sects. And thus, as he traveled around Palestine, he was able to hear many different stories related by a wide variety of human beings, all up and down the socioeconomic spectrum. And because of his exposure to so much diversity, Jesus' vision, according to Stephen Mitchell, came from beyond good and evil, and thus he could love the essence of humanity in all people. Love, or more accurately, empathy, requires us, as it did for Jesus, to move outside the safety of our accustomed circles in order to be touched by the stories that others tell. We may find some of those people to be highly disagreeable. Initially, we may find their values to be unacceptable. But by listening to them, we will probably experience what Peter Berger calls cognitive contamination. As these unfamiliar perspectives begin to condition and alter our own, as those perspectives begin to contaminate our thinking, and as our own tightly held beliefs and assumptions begin to break down, it becomes increasingly difficult, Berger asserts, to characterize the beliefs and the values of others as perverse, as insane, or as evil. They may be different, but they're not evil. This is precisely what happened to a man named Patrick J. Nolan, who was recently the subject of a story published in the New Yorker magazine. Nolan was a former prominent California state legislator. But in 1993, he was convicted of racketeering, and he spent 2 years in prison. He was a staunchly conservative law and order legislator prior to being incarcerated. But now, years later, he has become a passionate advocate for prison reform. Now, although cost-cutting and saving tax dollars are important pieces of the need for prison reform, Nolan says that what matters to him is simply this issue of human dignity, the dignity that is stripped away from human beings when they enter America's criminal justice system. Now, would Nolan have reached that conclusion about human dignity if he himself had not done time? It's quite unlikely. As the great Hasidic wisdom teacher Israel Baal Shem Tov once said, in order to pull someone out of the mud, you have to be willing to step into the mud yourself. Now, Charles Mann argues that in instructing his listeners to love the enemy, Jesus may also have been practicing a little spiritual and ethical jujitsu. These people, the enemy, Mann says, tend to become the center of your mental world. They haunt you. They become a greater focus than those that you really love and care about. And so by expressing love toward your enemies, you can create the opportunities for them to become, rather than antagonists, colleagues, which is, it would seem, a powerful act of self-serving love. Jesus wanted us to understand that when we treat someone as an enemy, it's no good for them, but in the long run, it doesn't do us any good either. Now, frankly, I am not looking forward to the next 16 months of electioneering with all the caustic commentary that is sure to accompany it. But that being said, I am hopeful that certain recent events signal something of a shift in the national mood, a shift in a more promising direction. Those moving gestures of forgiveness extended toward Dylan Roof by the families of his Charleston victims. The strong public disapproval shown toward the Confederate battle flag, that divisive symbol. The sharp criticism that Donald Trump's intemperate remarks provoked. And the heartfelt celebrations that accompanied the Supreme Court's decision on same-sex marriage. These are all positive signs, and they suggest to me that more and more Americans may be opting out of the paranoid style and choosing instead to stand on the side of love. And may that be our choice as well. Blessed be it. Amen. And now it is time for the giving and the receiving of our offertory. I invite you to be generous. Your donations support the programs of this wonderful institution, First Unitarian Society. We gather each week as a community of memory and of hope, and through this time and place, we bring our whole and, on certain occasions, our broken selves. We carry with us the joys and sorrows of the recent past, seeking here a place where they might be received and celebrated and shared. We have two joys to share this morning, one from Nancy and Andy Kossoff, that their daughter Ann and husband Ryan, who were married here at FUS out under the Oaks a year ago, they are now the parents of a healthy baby boy, Miles Evan. And then I would also like to share that we were able to be here for my father's 93rd birthday on Friday, and we wish him well, 2 days belated. In addition to those two just mentioned, we also acknowledge any unarticulated joys or sorrows that remain among us, and we hold those with equal concern in our hearts. Let us now sit silently for just a moment or two in the spirit of empathy and of hope. So by virtue of our brief time together today, may our burdens be lightened and our joys expanded. And now if you will turn to our closing hymn, number 323, and rise once more in body or in spirit. benediction and the postlude. The years of our lives are short, our lives precarious. Our days and nights go hurrying on, and there is scarcely time to do the little that we might do. And yet we do somehow find time for bitterness, for petty treason, for evasion. What can we do to stretch our hearts enough to lose their littleness? Here we are, all of us, all upon this planet, bound together by a common destiny, living our lives between the briefness of the daylight and the dark. Kindred in this, each lighted by the same precarious flickering flame of life, how does it happen that we are not kindred in other respects? How strange and how foolish these walls of separation that divide us. Blessed be, and amen.